It is 5 p.m. on the West Coast here, so we're going to get this kicked off and started for this edition of the Vancouver Power BI and Modern Excel User Group Meetup for Thursday, November 9th, or depending on whether you're coming to us from the future, like our host here is November 10th. So welcome everyone. We're going to dive into this. I'll run through my quick little bit here. So obviously we're into our welcome and overview section here. I just wanted to throw out a big thanks to the sponsors that make this session happen. Skillwave.training, for those of you who know or don't, is a project that's run by myself and my partner, Matt Allington. This is a place where we like to think that we can provide some of the best training around Power Query, Power Pivot, Power BI, Excel on the planet. So if you're looking for some great training on really starting to build advanced business intelligence in those different applications, you should definitely check us out. Excel Guru is the parent company of Skillwave and also the company that looks after developing and releasing Monkey Tools, which is my add-in to help you build better data models faster. Our next Excel meetup that we have coming up, I'm super excited. We've got a special presentation coming up from our friend Jan Karl Petiers. He's going to be talking about an introduction to VBA class modules. The cool thing about this session that's coming up is that this was originally actually written for some MVPs who were coming to Jan Karl and saying, hey, I need a little bit of help with this. So it should be a really good technical session for those of you who are actually writing code. It'll be amazing. I'm really looking forward to that. And then we're also looking forward to welcoming back Alex Kolokolov. Is going to be coming back on December 7th for our Power BI meetup, and that is going to be the last meetup of 2023, just so everybody knows there. Unfortunately, we don't have a Power BI meetup in November. Our speaker unfortunately did have to cancel and delay, so we're going to have to have him back later on, but that's the next Power BI track we have is on December 7th. That will be, both of these actually will be an early start time on the West Coast because they're both coming from Europe, so just be aware of that. Couple of quick notes here. I have released some new features and changes in Monkey Tools, and I just wanted to make sure that folks know about it. For those of you who are using Monkey Tools, our biblio tagging menu now is available to all users on a free license. I used to say that, hey, I would only allow this for pro license users. You could still do it with a free license, but you had to write the code. And that kind of got a little bit ugly because then the other thing that I did was, well, I just happened to go and actually add a whole bunch of more tagging options for data model type stuff. So where we used to just have measures and columns, we now have the ability to pick what specific types of tables you want or specific types of qualified columns, primary keys, foreign keys, calendar tables, and things like that to make the insertion process a lot quicker. So this allows a lot more granular tagging, provides shorter lists when you're actually trying to insert things to pick things from. And these tags are now available when you're actually working inside BiblioMonkey to all users, free license or pro. Naturally, of course, there's also always a bunch of bug fixes. I went through and did a massive run on bug fixes today, so there's going to be a new build coming out in future with even more. But I got through some of the key ones that were introduced along the way as I was building things. So if you haven't checked out Monkey Tools, you should definitely do so. My next semester of my Excel Fundamentals Bootcamp, last kickoff date for this year is December 13th. If you are looking to fill in knowledge gaps in your Excel journey, or if you have team members that are, this is a fantastic program that takes you through the basics of formulas and pivot tables and data visualization, as well as an introduction to Power Query. It's a great program if you're looking to really upskill your Excel side of things. So you can definitely check that out. And if you already are a pivot table master, you may be interested in looking at our self-service business intelligence bootcamp. Both of these products, not only do they have a lot of coaching and lessons to go through and teach you the stories from start to finish on how to work with data, but they also come with an annual subscription to our Ask Ken Anything sessions. I host 2 of those per month. They're up to 2 hours of live sessions where we actually work with the attendees to try and help them adapt these techniques to work in their own real world scenarios. So that is also something you should definitely check out if it sounds like it would be of interest to you. This meetup, along with every other one that we have, is recorded. It's hosted on the Skillwave YouTube channel. Takes me about 24 to 48 hours to produce these, but once we actually put them up there, you will get a notice through the meetup site. We post and let everybody know that it's there. So be watching for that. In about 48 hours, we'll have the recording of this meetup also posted, so you can check it back and take a little slower look at how Danielle does all the different techniques that she does. As far as bite-sized training, if you're ever interested in grabbing in or jumping into new bite-sized videos here, I've got a quick little video here that was inspired by my friend Wynn Hopkins here on how to customize the Power Query QAT. That's the latest one that we've actually just released, but there's a whole bunch of 48 other episodes of Monkey Shorts. Each of these is less than 3 minutes of technical content. So if you're looking for bite-sized learning, this is a great place to go. Finally, the last thing I want to throw out there is if you would like to speak at our meetup and talk about some cool things that you've done with Excel or Power BI, fill out our little form here. We'll get in touch with you and we'll get you on our show. And on that note, I'm going to step aside and go to Black here. Danielle, I'm going to turn the screen over to you, my friend. I think it's time to learn a little bit about some modeling techniques. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thanks. You should be able to see my screen. And
I can see it. Yeah.
I cannot see the chat. Gotta love it. All right.
Well, no worries. I can monitor the chat for you. If anything weird comes up, I can always pop in and bring those questions up for you. Oh, you got it? Okay, cool.
I got it. All good. All right. Okay, fantastic. Thank you. Yeah. So let me know if anything goes wrong. But we'll get started. So I understand, Ken, from previous sessions that you're not super strict on the timing. I will aim to get everything wrapped up within an hour, including questions. So I'll run.
I will say an hour-ish, whatever it takes. Right.
Okay.
So,
all right. Yeah. All right. So not a massively technical session, but I have got some Excel files, just for a couple of examples. They're just kind of little demo things that I'll go through. And I've sent that through to Rebecca. I don't know if you've got access to that, Ken, but I have already made that available. I've also got a sneaky little chapter from my dummies book, which I've thrown in there as well. So perhaps you can make that available, Ken, but we'll certainly get it out together with the recording. So that's already gone through to Rebecca. So a little bit about me. My topic on one of my favorite topics is reducing errors, because I think it's probably one of the things that is the most terrifying about, well, financial modeling, but in using Excel for any purpose, really. But first of all, a little bit about me. So I'm a Microsoft MVP and have been just for the last couple of years. I am a master financial modeler from the FMI. So I'm also a trainer for the FMI, teaching people how to pass the financial modeling exams, which are quite tough. I run meetup groups as well relating to financial modeling from time to time, and I'm the author of a financial modeling for dummies, as well as using Excel for business and financial modeling. And you can see some of my books just behind me there. So just a little bit about me. Thanks for that, Ken. Cool. All right, let's keep going. So just a bit of a definition about financial modeling. So I know some people might see it as perhaps just being a complex spreadsheet, but using Excel for the purpose of financial modeling is a heck of a lot more than just spreadsheeting. You know, the idea of a financial model is that it is a tool that's usually built in Excel, and it usually has lots and lots of moving parts. So it isn't just a spreadsheet. A spreadsheet could just be standalone, but a financial model or a model, any kind of Excel model, has always got a whole lot of moving parts and things that are changing. Inputs and outputs and things are changing all the time. And the potential for error with this is absolutely huge. So my definition that I've put in the dummies book is that it is a tool that's nearly always in Excel that displays possible solutions to real world financial problems. So usually you've got a problem that needs to be solved and you are solving it, providing possible outcomes, looking out into the future of how things might look. So that's really what a financial model is. And just give me a sec here. I can't I can't drive and talk at the same time. Okay. All right. So a little bit of difference between a spreadsheet and a financial model is that a financial model is more structured. So the idea of a financial model is that you have inputs, so assumptions, outputs, calculations. So there's usually specific areas of it. A spreadsheet is really just could be a list of telephone numbers or something like that. A financial model is dynamic. So a financial model should have inputs and outputs, but a spreadsheet is often just a single purpose standalone report. And really, you can't really call it a model unless you have this relationship between variables. So you change the inputs and the outputs change. That's really the purpose of a financial model. It's usually looking out into the future. And usually contains some kind of hypothetical outcomes. So it's scenario, sensitivity analysis, that kind of thing. So that's kind of a bit of an overview, or sort of setting the scene of what a financial model is. But what I'm really going to focus on today is the horror stories, the possibility that there could be an error in your financial model. Because if you are not absolutely terrified of having a mistake in your financial model, you should be. It's probably the number one thing that keeps us up at night, that possibility that there could be an error in your model. And I know that USprig has got a whole section on, I've got a link here for it. Yeah, so there's a whole section of horror stories for financial modelling, the dirty dozen. So, I'm sure everybody's got lots and lots of horror stories about things that have gone wrong with spreadsheets, and particularly spreadsheets, obviously, is, reports and things, obviously, they also need to be correct. But financial modelling, there's just very often there's a lot at stake with a financial model. So, you could be making millions and millions of dollars worth of decisions based on your financial model, and having an error in there is really quite terrifying. So let's have a look at a couple of the types of errors. Felicia says, yes, it could be potentially embarrassing when it's picked up by someone else. That's absolutely true, Felicia. I always say, the only thing worse than finding a mistake in your model, not finding a mistake in your model, or having someone else find a mistake in your model. That's really quite terrifying and quite embarrassing, and quite career limiting, having somebody else find an error, or pointing out, oh, that number doesn't look quite right. So we really don't want that to happen. Yeah, for sure. So the different types of model errors. So number one is probably the formula errors. So that where you're sort of typing away and you're just picking up the wrong range, or you do an alt equals for a sum and it includes the heading at the top if it's numerical, just that kind of silly mistake. And they are really easy mistakes to make, but they're also the easiest to fix, and they probably the most career damaging. Having the incorrect assumptions or inputs, so they're quite hard to find. If you just make a wrong assumption as the modeler, it can be quite hard to realise that's a problem. Because you assume that it's correct, and that's why assumption documentation is really important. So we'll talk about that today. And lastly, logic error. So that whole sort of flow of logic of how the formulas hang together. So they can be quite difficult to identify as well. So these are the kind of things that I'm going to focus on today. So first of all, I'll go through a couple of technical strategies to reduce error. So some things, really, really simple things, nothing like massively technical or difficult, but some strategies that you can use to reduce the possibility of error. We'll look at a couple of tips and tricks. So those are all things that you can do as you're building the model. And then lastly, some things that you can do to help check or audit someone else's model for errors. So looking at your own models, and then also looking at other people's models as well. So first of all, we'll jump into some technical strategies to reduce error. And this comes from, I think it's chapter 13 of the Dummies book. There's like a whole chapter on the strategies for reducing errors. And I've actually popped the entire chapter. Don't tell my publisher. But I've actually put the entire chapter. I popped it into, I've given it to Rebecca. I think Ken's going to share it with you. So it's got quite a few strategies for reducing error. So I'll go through each of those with you now. So these are the 10 strategies that you can use as some things that you can do as you're building the model to stop errors from creeping into your work. So I'm going to go through each of those points now. So number one is using the enter key. So that's something that's really important. So let me just demonstrate. So let's say, for example, so here I've got an example of a model, and here we have, we're modeling away, and we're sort of, going to my F2, and here's an example of a horrible formula to audit, the offset function, which I do find useful in certain situations, but it can be quite difficult to audit and to stop the offset from going off the page. You often have to put an if error around it, which I know a lot of modelers say not to use. I do use it sometimes, but if you could try to avoid the if error. So bad example here of using firstly a model of a formula that's difficult to audit, and also using an if error, which can be a little dubious. But what's even worse than that is if you finished editing the formula and you just click somewhere else. So when you go into the formula, most of the time you'll get away with it like I just did then. But every now and then, you can be in the middle of a formula and, it'll just accidentally pick up something like that. And, what a lot of, you might accidentally hit error, and then you find that there's, the formula is completely wrong, or, you've added in an extra number that you didn't intend. So, and what's even worse than that is I see people go like this, they're gone, they click away, and then they click somewhere else, and they haven't looked at what the number has given you. So it's a good idea to get into the habit of always hitting the enter key. You've done your formula, you check it, you test it, you hit the enter key, you use your F2 or your double click F2 to just see, to make sure that it's picking up the correct cell. So I'd say that's number one, is using the enter key. So enter your formula, hit the enter key, look at it. Does it look sensible? Does it look right? And check your work. So after you've hit the enter key, look at the formula. Does the value look correct? Does it look sensible? Does it look like the number that you expect? And after you've checked it, check it again, go in and use your F2 key, and perhaps even an offline calculator to sense check and make sure that the values are correct. And after you've checked it 3 times, actually have somebody else check it as well. So, when you finished the entire model, I used to have a bit of a deal with one of my colleagues. I would actually ask them to check my models, and then I would check their models. And so that's quite a good idea to get into the habit of explaining, going through the calculations with someone else. Having someone else. You can get quite snowblind when it comes to your own formulas and calculations. So try to have somebody else look at it as well. We'll talk also about assumptions. So making sure that you can document and validate those assumptions. So assumptions are garbage in and garbage out. So make sure that it's really clear, clearly lay out and document those assumptions for any decision makers that are going to be using it. So make it super clear. Like, as I said, if you've got millions of dollars riding on a financial model, and people will just accept it and go, oh, the financial model says that we are going to make millions of dollars on this project, so hey, let's go ahead with it. And that's, it really depends on the inputs that you've used and making sure that those assumptions are right. Another thing that you can do is to document, using like your methodology. So even using a kind of flow chart. If anyone's got any tips, like I'm kind of, giving you a couple of my tips, the things that I think are the most useful, but do feel free to jump in the chat if you've got any other, I know there's a few, particularly with this flow chart thing. I don't have any sort of, I feel quite strongly about using just generic, like just standard Excel. So I don't use any add-ins. Sorry, Ken, but I don't use like add-ins or other sort of tools. I tend to just try to, as a trainer, I try to sort of just want people to be able to use Excel as it comes out of the box. But if anyone's got any recommendations for, I know there's some nifty little add-ins that you can use for documentation that will take, parts of calculations, cells and kind of documenting the methodology or the logic of the model. So feel free to pop that into the chat if you've got any ideas. And stress testing, so things like, putting in some nonsense. So like, for example, if you put in, revenue, your price is 0. Obviously, your model's never going to have price as 0. Your revenue your entire revenue would be 0, for example. So making sure that that the model, that's kind of testing the technical workings of the model. So that's a good one. So for example, you might put in, like, I don't know, double the head count, and you would expect that if you doubled your head count, then the staff cost would double as well. I mean, obviously you're not going to double the head count overnight, but you'd want to see if that actually works, like if the model is doing its job, that kind of thing. Okay, yeah, plugins, Rob. Devisha says, I love hero tools. Oh, not heard of that one. For reporting, report writing. Yeah, cool. Easy table of contents. That's something that Excel doesn't really do very well automatically. It's a table of contents, which, you can obviously build it using hyperlinks and things, but having a tool that creates, table of contents and navigation's really interesting. Yeah, if you have a link for that, Devisha, yeah, cool. Oh, it's not being sold anymore, Ken says. Oh, interesting. Okay. So charting using the old F11, your F11 shortcut. Try it out. If you highlight some data and then hit F11, it'll throw in an instant chart. Looking at what metrics look like over time, that can really help to flush out or to identify any anomalies or anything that looks odd in your model. So another method is using scenarios and sensitivity analysis. So any good financial model should always have scenarios in there, and generally they should be scenarios that are, so this is not stress testing, this is scenarios that are within the realm of possibility, and stress testing would be something different that we just talked about. But for example, if I just share, Win says flowcharts. Win's just shared a appdiagrams.net. That's great. Cool. Thanks for that, Win. Yeah, so that's an example, super simple example of a scenario. So that's using a little drop-down box. You could use a data validation drop-down, or I've used a combo drop-down. So you change the drop-downs and all the numbers change. And so that's just a really simple way of flicking from one scenario to another. So the way that, you change the drop-down and then all of the numbers change. And you could see by testing it using different scenarios, you might be able to really flush out where there's a problem in the model. So that's another little tip that you can, or little tool that you could use. And in fact, any good financial model will always have some scenarios in it. I mean, I would argue that really the whole point of building a financial model is so that you can build scenarios, and if you structure the model properly, where you just input, you have one single input that drives all of the formulas, then building scenarios is not going to be that difficult. So moving on to the next one, strategies. Another strategy is taking note of Excel errors. I actually quite like Excel errors. I don't know if that's whether you guys agree with me, but I would actually much prefer to see an Excel error than a number that looks like it could be right, but completely wrong. So I would much rather see one of these than see a number that's incorrect, because it's very easy for errors to slip through if you don't see these. And of course, we have our a new error, our spill error. So, if you've got something in the way, that's something, when you're using dynamic if you're using the new dynamic arrays, if you were doing a unique formula, for example, having, something in the way, you should always give dynamic arrays lots of space. Same with a pivot table. If you're ever including a pivot table, we don't use a lot of pivot tables in pure dynamic financial models because you want, with a financial model, you change the inputs and the outputs change. Pivot tables aren't as easily changeable, whereas dynamic arrays are. Dynamic arrays are fantastic for financial modeling, but you do need to be careful about giving dynamic arrays lots of space. And so, making sure that it's got something to go, give it a little bit of space. So that's an Excel error that a new one to be careful of. So, and lastly, circular references. Not really an error as such. Some modelers will actually put a circular reference into a financial model deliberately. I try not to. A circular reference is, in my opinion, something that you should avoid. And if you see that message that says you have a circular reference, if you did not intend to make that circular reference, you should, get rid of it. So, the idea of a circular reference, Excel doesn't know how to do that. And Excel does have an error checking tool. That is a great way of finding all of those offending circular references in the models. So if you go into the formula tabs, you can see the circular references option. So let's say, for example, actually, I don't have an example here, but let's say if I create this, if I were to just create a really simple circular reference, if I were to make that into a circular reference, and you get this one here, a really easy way of finding that, if you were to inherit this model and you're in another tab, you open it up, you can see that there's a circular reference. If you do not intend for there to be a circular reference, or you don't want that circular reference, if someone's enabled iterative calculations, but an easy way of finding a circular reference, if you need to hunt it down and to kill it, is to just go into the formulas tab, and then it will just give you a list of where that offending cell is, and that can help you to find it. So in my opinion, I would prefer not to have a circular reference unless you really, really need to. And probably certainly in financial modeling, the only reason that you would need a circular reference is if you're doing an interest calculation. That's where you perhaps would have your interest payment that is driving your cash flow, and your cash flow drives your debt, and your debt drives your loan, and your loan drives your debt, which drives your interest, your interest, hang on, I said that wrong, I think. So interest was going to be an input into your P&L, and your P&L is perhaps going to drive your cash flow, and your cash flow drives your debt, your borrowing, which then drives your interest, which is then going to be an input into your P&L, and you do end up with a circular reference. And we try to avoid that where possible, but I know that some financial modelers will say that that's okay, and that you should have it. That's probably the only situations that you would perhaps have a circular reference. So if you are choosing to put a circular reference into your financial model, just be really wary of it. And I would say to use perhaps a switch or something like that. Ken says, I don't build models without a pivot table. I figured that might be the case, Ken. Make it clear that the model is not live and needs a refresh. Yes. Love pivot tables, of course, but when it comes to dynamic models, that you want to have them, unless you've got like a whole lot of data in your model, a pivot table is a great way of summarizing it. But I am finding myself I was building a model yesterday actually, where previously I would have probably used pivot tables to sort of manage the data, but I found myself just using dynamic arrays instead, because dynamic arrays are alive and they're sort of better for financial modeling. So dynamic arrays are absolutely fantastic, and if you're not using them, you should. Win says creating a pivot table for summarizing but not calculations. No F1 certificate for Ken. Yes, and he says you add an error check. We always would add an error check wherever you possibly can, to make sure that the inputs are the same as a pivot table. Yes, for sure. Which brings me to my next point, which is using error checks. So a good financial modeler would always be looking for opportunities to include error checks. So they will, these are probably not going to help you so much as you're building the model, probably more for other people who are using the model, but and so they shouldn't replace good modeling practice, but it is a good idea to always include error checks as much as you can. So if you're putting error checks into your model, make sure that that you pay attention to them. We often have error checks that are showing all the time, so don't ignore them. And perhaps we can also use, conditional formatting and, building them as you go is probably a good idea. So a couple of examples here on error check. So this one here is just a really simple, if one cell is equal to the other, and that's what Ken's talking about, where if that were a pivot table at down below, you could just as easily create a little error check. Excel does, I think, truncate at a certain number of decimal places. So sometimes you can have something calculating one way and another way, and it can be 0.00 something out. So that will give you a false error check. So that's why I've used the absolute ABS, absolute value of the difference between two is greater than 1. So I've allowed a tolerance for one error as error to say, or you could change that, of course, to make it 0.001 or something like that if you want to make the tolerance for error to be a little smaller like that. So that's one method of error checks. Another method here, and that's probably my favorite, is just one cell minus the other. It doesn't need to be complicated, just something super, super simple. Just one cell minus the other. And then I just find the quickest way to do that, rather than, I don't want to see it like that. I usually just go boom like that, make it into a little dash and then just change it to red. And that way you've got something that you see a little red dash, you can see that that's an error check. That's my personal favorite of doing an error check. So that's the 10 strategies. So these are the things. So I've given you a chapter that comes from chapter 13. So I'll make that available for you if you'd like to go over it. And I just wanted to move now. I'll just check in and see if there's any questions before I move on to the next section. No, I keep managing to keep up with the chat, so do feel free. Sessions like this, sometimes you get just as much value out of the banter and the commentary from what everyone says. So feel free to, if you have any comments or you don't agree with some of the things some of the stuff can be quite controversial. So do feel free to jump in, and at the end we'll unmute as well if anybody has any comments they'd like to add. So a couple of tips and tricks and do's and don'ts that I'd like to add, and these come from the two books. So best practice. In fact, I've dedicated a whole chapter in each of these books just because best practice, I think, is just so important. So the 6 points of best practices, I'd like to just kind of go through them, because a lot of what we call or what we consider to be best practice in financial modelling is actually trying to reduce the possibility for error. This is the problem with using Excel, is that you can create just about anything in Excel, but it is just so easy to make a mistake. So we're trying to reduce the possibility for error. So we did talk about assumptions briefly earlier, but I just wanted to go through a couple of technical ways of documenting assumptions. And I know that documentation of assumptions is not the sexy part of financial modelling, but I would recommend that you do it as you go, like to try to, wherever you're, thinking like, put in an error check, or you're thinking, well, I need to make it clear that this came from here, and to make sure that you don't, pick up the wrong thing, or to show, what time period it was, or to put the source is to document that as you go, and a couple of tools for how to do that. So I'll go through a couple of those now. If you just go into some in-cell comments, so things like that. So that's just using the little notes. So you can just go in and add a note that way. Or you can do it that way. Actually, that used to be called a comment. They've changed the name of it a few years ago. So you can actually do sort of threaded comments and things like that. So they're quite good for documentation, adding these sort of comments and threaded comments in there. That can be a useful way of adding it. I don't tend to use that as much, probably more because they don't print out or they're not immediately obvious. I would probably prefer to have it sort of, listed out. So something like this, where we say, based on 2019 or based on historical data, something like that. Or the fact that, VAT is excluded for the purpose of the model, that kind of thing, to have it actually showing. Another method, though, is to have something like that, where, you have the little in-cell comment show up, and that's just using your data validation. So, just going into your input message, and I quite like that for modeling, and more for your users. So rather than having like a whole lot of instructions, you can just make it quite discreet, because they don't see it unless they click on the cell. So really, really simple. So you click on it, you go, that's right. Remember, we have to remember that that the growth applies to all the 5 years, things like that. Just things that you want to make sure that your user is aware of, and this can reduce the errors of them using the model for sure. The other method perhaps is using some footnoting. I don't know about you, Kim, but I never use this this kind of header footer thing, because you can't link to it. I don't find it particularly useful. I mean, and we hardly ever print stuff out anymore. If I'm going to do a header or footer, I tend to use superscript. So I'd probably be more likely to do perhaps something like this, where you would go, I'm getting ahead of myself, but if you put in ampersand or something like that, and link to that, or put in do like that number 1, and then you would put 1, and then you would add that in. I'd probably be more likely to do something like that, and then do the same superscript above. So that way, if you were to change that to 2, and then that's just kind of a manual way of creating hyperlinks within a model, or footnotes within a model. It's just a fairly sort of a very low tech way of doing it. I mean, Word's done something like that, quite automated for years now, and Excel doesn't really have that. Ken says he uses your page numbers and that. Yeah. If anyone's got any other tips for doing this, because I find that quite time consuming having to do that, but I do tend to use footnotes a lot in models, so just documenting what's there. Hyperlinks, of course, just adding insert, putting in your hyperlink and saying, putting in blah.com, website, nothing. So of course, something like that. And of course you could do hyperlinks within the model as well, or by linking to your intranet or wherever you got the data from. So that's a good use of documentation. But of course, having something like this where it's just hard coded, like just putting in any commentary, that way you're absolutely sure like they're not going to miss that. But using the dynamic text, so something like that, where you put anything with equals, any kind of anything that is text, you put inverted commas around it, and then so if we were to just say, the last year is ampersand, and then add. Of course, that is always going to show when it's a calculation, and so that's why we've had to use the text function. So we just wrap it inside a text, of course, and then that will, comma, hash, and that will that will just format it for you. And you can do the same thing with the dates as well. So we do a lot of this, any kind of documentation, we would always try to keep the documentation inside the model. So I see a lot of people when they go to build they build a model and then they have an assumptions document. And as soon as you take it outside the model, of course, the numbers are going to be out of date. So I would say wherever you put in a number, that you should use this technique and have all of your assumptions listed like that, because it's just going to save you so much time as you go. So that's just a couple of methods for documenting assumptions. Nothing overly complex or technical there, but I'll give you a copy of the file so you can take a look at that if you like. And yeah, number 2, so coming back to financial modelling best practice, firstly, documentation of assumptions using consistent formulas. This is got to be the number one thing I think that you can do to reduce errors when you're building a model. Absolutely. So, having one single formula all the way across the block of data. And I can't tell you, it's so simple, but what I see a lot of people do is when they're building a formula and they go like this, they go like that, and then they go like this, and maybe they'll anchor it one way but not the other, and they're having to sort of rebuild the formula. So using something like this, where you have the dollar sign goes in front of the row or the dollar sign goes in front of the column. I'm sure you guys have used this before, but it's amazing how many people aren't actually using it when they build a model. So that way, you might have 12 months across the page and, a couple of thousand products, and just having one single block. It's really important in financial modelling best practice is to have consistency of formulas all the way across and down, and being able to use, knowing where those dollar signs go. It's going to make it super simple. I'm going to assume everybody's all good with that. Yes, that's true, Ken. Pivot tables use consistent formulas. Yes. Yeah, a lot of the new things are really encouraging consistency of formulas. And same with tables. When you put a formula inside a table, it's going to be consistent and goes all the way down. And we're really trying to encourage that. And it's certainly best practice in financial modelling. Having and Excel allows it. It allows you to have inconsistent formulas, and it's just a bad idea. So getting into dynamic arrays. So another way of doing it would be to say that's your entire range multiplied by the entire range. And then if you just hit enter, that is going to, by default, that's why I love dynamic arrays so much, because they kind of force you to make it consistent. I must say though, I don't know, let me know what you guys think, but if you were to inherit a model, I would prefer to see something like that, where you can actually pick up and see exactly where the numbers are coming from. Whereas with this, it's a little bit more difficult to kind of audit. To me, I tend to use dynamic arrays more inside formulas, not so much something like this. Lambda functions and making them checkable. Oh, that's my main issue with lambdas, is that they're more difficult. They're difficult to audit. And it's fine if you've built it and you know how to do it, but a lot of the financial modelling to me is you build, there's always about 10 different ways of doing something. You could do it like this, you could do it like that, and I'm going to show you a couple of other ways now. And you've got a choice as a modeler, which technique you're going to use and which formula you're going to use. And you're always using the formula or the technique that's easy to follow, easy to understand, less prone to error. Those are the decisions that you're making as the modeler, which technique you're going to use. And to me, lambdas, whilst incredibly useful, are difficult for most people to follow. If you're, and there's a small percentage of the population that are, all over lambdas and using them all the time and would be able to take them apart, but that's not most people. And we're building models for other people to use. And it's the same, it's the same principle with VBA to my mind. I would prefer to avoid it if possible, because it's a bit of a black box, and people can't follow it as easily. So if you could do it using a simple formula, I would. But sometimes the functionality requires for you to go further and make something more complex. And so then I would say, yes, by all means, go ahead and use the lambda function. Yeah, okay. So Ken says we're having Charles Williams. I had the wonderful pleasure of meeting Charles in person finally when I was in the UK recently. He'll be showing the Lambda Explorer tool to unwind the black box of a Lambda function. Fantastic. Looking forward to that, Ken. That sounds like a great idea. So just talking about named ranges, which I'm sure people are familiar with, and people, when they learn named ranges, they go, oh, fantastic. I'm going to use, interest rate. I'm going to create a named range here. I'm going to call that interest rate 1. Oh, no, that's a bad one. It's going to be interest rate. I'll use an underscore. So we'll say interest rate underscore 1. Let's use interest rate underscore 2. And let's say here, we'll call this one interest rate underscore 3. Fantastic. So let's use that as our named range. We need to use, you need to anchor that or use your dynamic array. And we're going to use our named range for that one. And then we copy that across. And of course, that's not going to work. So we go, oh, great, I've got to change that to the second interest rate, copy it down. And so that is just really bad. I would not recommend using named ranges in that instance. So something like that where you've got 3 different named ranges, it's just yeah, not a good idea. If you are going to use named ranges, and I do think they're great for, if it's for an assumption that you're going to use and reuse over and over, absolutely, a named range is good. But I would probably prefer to do something like that where you've got all 3 cells and you go interest, and then your borrowing amount would be here. And then you'd be able to just go interest multiplied by borrowing and then tab it up, and then that's going to pick up the whole lot. And that's, using a dynamic array and using a named range. I don't know, there's multiple ways of doing it. I'd say don't use this technique. But I mean, the first way, I still model like that. I think that's quite sufficient, something like that. So that is the second part of financial modelling best practice. We said it was using assumptions, documenting assumptions, using consistent formulas, really important for reducing the possibility for error. Third is always link as much as you can. Try not to link to external files, but if you do, try perhaps using Power Query instead, or using named ranges. They're a bit more robust than just using a random link. Being able to trace the source data. So we'd say, the only hard coding should be input variables, and we put them in an input style or using a blue font. So that's an example. Using a corkscrew in a financial model. We often, with our cash flow, you have your opening, which then links down to your closing, that then links up to your opening, that then links down to your closing. And what I see a lot of people do is they just go in and, this surplus or deficit, they would just go in and hard code, of course, which kind of defeats the purpose. You should use a round formula instead. You could round at comma -3. That will round it. We go round up, comma -3. That will round it up to the nearest 1,000, or comma -6 will round it up to the nearest million. And you can use that to calculate the nearest, the amount that you need to borrow. So I would say always linking is a good idea. So a couple of examples there with linking. So couple of questions. Do you use scenarios for test cases? What do you mean by, Mark? Do you mean scenarios like I demonstrated a scenario just using a drop down, which to me is probably the simplest way of doing a scenario. Do you mean scenario manager? Because I never use scenario manager, and I don't know anyone who does. And yes, Cindy says, can we have the PowerPoint? Yes, I have made that available already. Linking, always linking. So having, your cost of capital, for example, here, if you were to change that to 9%, that of course is going to drive your NPV. and that's going to drive your description. So you guys know how to do that. And then I've just got a little title on the top. You know, if you just have a title on a chart, you would just do a chart title, go to the formula bar, equals, click enter, and so you have that will just automatically change. So you say, well, if my cost of capital were to change, so you have one, you know, this principle of having one single cell, you change the inputs and that just drives everything else in the model. So that is linking and entering once. So, you know, always having you know, never enter the same value twice, you know, one single cell and having it link and not using a value within a formula. So you would never type a number into a formula. You always want to make your formulas as robust as possible. That's a really fast way of having an error is, you know, typing a number in, and that's it's going to be out of date. Or what's even worse than that, you know, people put in like the little plus something at the end of the formula, and it's really going to cause problems. And let's see, yeah, and so yeah, another one I mentioned was daisy chaining or spaghetti link. So what I mean by that is where you link to a link that then links to a link right throughout the model, and that's a bad example here. So let's say you've got, you know, here we've got January 22 and everything hangs off that. So I've just used an EO month function to roll that forward so that next year you can do yourself out of a job. So next year when the client asks you or doesn't ask you to come back, they can just change it to the following year and then that will just roll forward. But what you shouldn't do is link to there and then this one should link to the original, because if you were to link to here, for example, it's just a bad idea, because we call that daisy chaining, which then links to a link that then links to a link, because later on you might say, well, actually, we don't need this block of data. Let's just remove that, get rid of it, and it's going to screw everything up. And so the way that I had it previously, where that one there, so I had it, that one linking to there and that one, we always link to the source. So it's a good practice to always link to the source wherever you can, so that here, if you were to remove that, it just makes the model more robust to always link to the source and to not have daisy chain or spaghetti links for that reason. It just makes it quite hard to follow and to audit. So, you know, linking to a link like as you go through. And lastly, error checks, which we've talked quite a lot about error checks. So, you know, always, you know, thinking of opportunities to put error checks into your model. So we've looked at already at a couple of different ways of doing it. And lastly, always using formatting and labeling. So probably the most common type of error is mixing units, you know, just getting mixed up with, particularly with, you know, units of like thousands or millions, or miles and kilometers, or currency, you know, Canadian dollars versus Australian dollars, you know, stuff like that, because they're not that much different in value. And, you know, you may not, unless you make it really, really clear. So that's probably something that that does happen quite frequently, more than we would like to. We would like to know the possibility of having incorrect labeling or incorrect, you know, just picking up, interpreting the data incorrectly. So that was, you know, a couple of points of best practice. So I'll just check back to see. Yeah, Mark's asking about scenario manager. Do I use scenarios for test cases? Yeah, I don't use scenario manager. I just find using data tables are much better. You know, using data tables to test sensitivities are just far superior to scenario manager. I mean, you can use scenario manager, but it's quite clunky. It's like a little tool. You got to go in and, like, you know, enter everything. So I tend not to use scenario manager that much. Yeah. So lastly, a couple of techniques of checking somebody else's model for errors. You know, I'd much rather create my own model from scratch, Somebody, if a client were to come to me and say, hey, I need you to build a financial model, I'd go, great, fantastic, I'll do that. And you can, to build it from the ground up. But usually that doesn't happen. Usually they've got a model that, hey, we've got a model, it's not working properly, or hey, we've got an issue, a budget, we've got to roll it forward for the following year, something like that. And someone else built the model, and you don't know, how they did it, what their skills are. So, if you're going to inherit somebody else's model, your choices are really, having to either start from scratch, which is really, that's a really time-consuming thing to do, or to validate and verify the existing model. And usually we have to go with number two. We just simply don't have we just don't have the luxury of being able to start over with every single time we build a model. That's incredibly time consuming. So, if you ideally, or to go through with it with the original person who built it, but usually they're not available. They've moved on to a bigger and better job because they've got such great financial modeling skills, and so you may not they may not be available to go through it with you. So usually you have to validate and verify the existing model. And so when you meeting a model for the first time, hello, how are you? So hello model, what are you doing? Having to look at somebody else's spreadsheet or model and seeing what is this model doing. There's a couple of things that you can do when you look at that model. You need to So, looking at things like formatting, the formulas, the calculations, checking for external links, checking for named ranges, looking at, what the different features are. Are the formulas consistent? What kind of calculations are there? Are there hidden tabs, hidden areas of the model? We often find that there are hidden calculations that we may not realize are there, that sort of thing. And one of the things that you might find useful, in fact, I think is quite underused, is inspect documents. I don't know if you guys have ever used that, but where if you go into file and then info, check for issues, and then go to inspect documents. So if you just go file, info, check for issues, inspect document, and you need to save the model, and then it will go through, you need to save your file, and it will actually go through and look for all of these things. So it will see what is in the model. So I often find that quite useful. So check that out. So if you haven't, if you come across a model for the first time that you're not familiar with, try that out. And then when you've sort of looked at that, you can have a look at a couple of audit tools. So, a couple of things like, going into edit mode. So we've looked at that, using your F2 to sort of check model, trace precedence and dependence. So that's just on your formula tab. So I'll go through and demo some of these. Evaluate formula, adding, part of the formula manually, background error checking. So that's one of your options, showing formulas, and your camera tool, as well as find and select. So a couple of different options. There's also some add-ins tools that you can use. So I'll just demo some of those. So a couple of, and feel free to jump into the chat if you have any other. I know people have got their sort of little favorite auditing tools that you can use. So it's just on the formulas tab. Trace precedence is quite useful if you've got data on another tab. So if you've got that, let's say you're linking it over here and you were to go to trace precedence, that's going to just jump to another tab. I actually quite like the shortcut of control back square bracket. That's going to jump. So control back square bracket or control G enter to go back. So that's just a little square bracket next to the P, I think, on your keyboard. So jump backwards Control G, enter to go. So I use that one a lot, sort of going backwards and forwards. If you are looking at a formula and you're going, what the heck is that? What is that doing there? If you hit your F9, so try your F9 shortcut, that will give you the value. And that is, see the little tooltips that just popped up then? That's a little new feature there. Yeah. Oh, Ken's just added a resource. I haven't seen that one. Thanks for that, Ken. Jan Carell has a tool for auditing formulas. Fantastic. It's great. Now, the other thing you can use is show formulas. That's going to show all of your formulas. You can go into evaluate formula, but I personally prefer to just go into the formula and to just go, what is that there? You know, is that true or false, that section of the formula? And just F9, and you can see that comes up with false, so you can then copy and paste that somewhere else as well. So just a couple of tools that you might find useful. Yeah, Mark says evaluate formula. Interesting. I never use evaluate formula. Came up yesterday. I was trying to use it, and I just don't find it useful personally. I tend to just do it manually. Yeah. And yeah, if you are going to use the financial model for funding, so if you have, if the bank is going to give you millions of dollars based on the financial model, they probably want the model audited. And I don't mean audit, I mean not like an accounting audit from an accounting sense of, or a tax audit. I mean a model review where they will actually go in and check and test them. And takes it apart and checks it absolutely meticulously for errors. So having it professionally audited can be incredibly expensive, but it's really the only way to make sure that there's no errors. And so, yeah, some of the things that we've talked about can really make it a lot cheaper and easier to get a formal model review done. So quite a common problem is having redundant assumptions in the model. So trying to find redundant assumptions. So often people build parts of the model and there's assumptions that are not actually being used. So that's something to be aware of. And of course, the way to find that is to go through every assumption and say, well, hey, where is this being used? So if you were to go into here and you'd say, well, here's an assumption, you can tell that it's an assumption because of the way that I formatted it. And you can go to trace dependence and you could see, yes, it's being used. But if it wasn't being used, you could consider getting rid of it. Lastly, just sharing your work. So, if you've spent a lot of time building the model, you take pride in your work and you want to own the entire model, and your instinct is that this model is mine and you want to keep it to yourself and you don't want to have anybody to mess anything up. But modeling should be a collaborative team effort. So you should build models in such a way that others can understand, edit, use the model, interpret the results. So you really, in my opinion, you really want to be the sort of modeler that makes a good financial model, but one that others can easily follow, and to make sure that it doesn't have errors in it. So you want to make sure that you, as a user, if you don't understand where the model comes from, you can sort of go through and audit and check it and make sure that you're comfortable with it. So that is pretty much it from me. So these are my my sort of areas that I wanted to kind of cover with you. And I'll just check in and see if there's any comments or questions. Mark says not an audit, just a model audit. Yeah. So it can be a little bit confusing when you're talking about an audit. People think it's like a tax audit, but so they often call it a model review rather than a model audit. So lastly, if you do want to become a financial modeler, these are the skills that you really need to have. You firstly need to be have really good technical skills, but you do need to understand the industry. You need to kind of know what a P&L cash flow balance sheet looks like. Have a some business knowledge, design skills, be able to communicate well, numeracy and logic. These are all the things that a good financial modeler will have. And so just as a bit of a summary, each of those things. So it is an absolutely wonderful career to get into. I expect that you're probably using Excel quite a lot already, and using Excel for the purpose of finance and decision making. It's just an amazing career and a wonderful thing to be involved in. So I would say that that you definitely should put it on your resume and try to make sure that you put use every opportunity to apply your financial modeling skills. And if you become a certified financial modeler, if you find that you are if financial modeling is something that you need for your job, that's something that you should consider perhaps becoming a certified modeler with the Financial Modelling Institute. So thank you, everybody. Yeah, Felicia says, I really like the idea of documenting assumptions. Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Mark, for your comments. That's great. And if there are any women out there, there is definitely a lack of women in the industry. I have a meetup group. I'd love to have you join us. Any women who are interested in financial modelling, we get together all the time, and that's my contact details. I'd love to. I spend a lot of time, probably too much time, on LinkedIn, so I'd love to see you on there. If you'd like to connect with me, if you have any questions, you are very welcome to get in touch with me via LinkedIn, and I'll just hang around now and see if there's any questions or comments from anyone. Thanks for that, Mark.
Fantastic. Thanks, Danielle. Yeah, if there are any comments or questions, please, by all means, throw them into the chat. Danielle, I'm actually going to share a workbook with you really quickly here, just because you'd asked about different techniques and the way that people do things. And so full disclosure for everybody here, Danielle has never seen this before. We never exchanged notes. We did not discuss this beforehand. So just want to make that clear up front. But so this is a model that a financial model that I've actually built for a course that I taught. And one of the things that you'd mentioned about is documenting assumptions, right? So yeah. You can see in the top here, we have all the assumptions that we use. These are all the different variables that there's going to be an increase in the food costs. I've got that documented in this. Every assumption is actually made. Nothing is ever hard coded into a formula. And generally, the way that I will do these things is I actually have a little grouping thing on the top here. So I'll actually collapse it down. So there's a message there that uses an aggregate function to check whether or not the rows are hidden. And says, hey, if you want it, you can click it, you can expand it. And I find that's actually a really helpful technique for dealing with things like this, where you're dealing with your schedules. Because I know you'd mentioned like footnoting is really, really hard. So I don't bother. I actually will put in something like this, and then I say, look, here's all my schedules down the bottom here. You want to go see schedule 2, you can open it up. That's you fun. Can print it if you want, right? So it just gives a slightly different method for going through to some of these things. And I don't know, I love the aggregate function for that, for hiding those different messages. So
yeah, good one.
So there you go.
In that. Yeah, so getting, because I think people get a bit bamboozled with, they say, oh, that's all the numbers, and I think it's nice to keep things clean and clear for people so they only see what's really required. And then if they want to get into more detail, they can. So yeah, using the grouping is great. Yeah.
It works really well for that. And like I say, I mean, this one has, I've actually got an additional level in this only because there's a hidden component for this that was part of what I was playing around with the course. But can I share that example? I probably cannot. Actually, no, I'm sorry, Mark, I can't. This one has a consideration behind it that I can't actually just pop this one out the door. So drop me a note, we'll talk. So anyhow, but yeah, so kind of a neat, where's the book cash recon? Book cash, what does that mean, Seth? Explain that to me. I don't actually, anyhow. Yeah, so I don't know, say it's just an alternative. And like I say, I find this really, really useful in big things, especially when they get complex like that, because you've got everything documented, but not everybody wants to see it all the time. So it works fairly well for that.
Nice one.
Yeah,
right. So and I think that's what's great about these sessions is people sharing their different techniques and different ideas. it's always good to see other people's ways of doing things.
One day we should put together a meetup where we can do the pros and cons of pivot tables though for financial modeling, because I feel like we could have a cage match on this.
Oh no, I'm never going to win that one, because pivot tables are just fantastic. But for financial modeling, we try to. They're great for like quick. We always say, you got your data, just trying to kind of figure out what's going on. But then if you want to build a model later, it's for other people to use, I'd say.
See, I use them both for inputs and outputs. And I mean, I've got one model that was a 20-year forecast for a massive housing development that I built without pivot tables the first time. And keeping that thing maintained scared the bejesus out of me. The second time we built one, I did it all with Power Pivot and Power Query, and the maintenance of it was so much easier. And so it depends on what you're doing. But that's the thing, is like, you just got to know, the people that are refreshing it and using it have to understand that is a component, right? So, and that's the tricky part, I think, with this, is that we have, in many cases, a lack of, not numeracy necessarily, but also just an understanding of how the tools all work. And that's the part that we got to try and nail down, in my opinion. But
I think I find people are not using how query, the idea of having being able to pull, just simply to pull data in. People are still linking, which it's just so much more robust to do that. And then perhaps to use those tables to build either formulas or pivot tables to summarize from that, or dynamic arrays. Oh yes, good point. Yes, I see Jim said recommend. I didn't mention that. Creating a tab for all the error checks. Absolutely, definitely. That is a very good idea. Thank you, Jim.
Definitely agree with that one. Awesome. Any other questions that anybody wants to throw in last minute before we wrap up for the day? If not, we'll proceed with the closing anyway, but we can always divert for another question. But don't forget, folks, the recording of this will be up in the next 24 to 48 hours. Just gives me a little bit of time to go through and do the processing here. I see that Rebecca has already posted the links to Danielle's materials on the Meetup site, so you can go and grab those from there. I'll make a note once the video is available for you. And don't forget that the signups are open for our next meetup. Jan Carl is going to be joining us next week. So it's coming up pretty soon. So if you're interested in seeing what Jan Carl's got to say, and why wouldn't you be, honestly, you definitely got to check that out. So sign up and hopefully join us there. So, and on that note, I don't see any other questions coming in. Danielle, thanks a ton for your time coming back and doing this again. I really appreciate it. And we'll see you next time.
Yeah.
So, all right.
Thanks, Ken. Good to
Cheers.
see you. Bye.
You bet. You too. Bye-bye.